In early March 1944, Luftwaffe pilots intercepting American bombers high above Berlin looked out of their cockpits and saw a physical impossibility. Single-engine fighters were flying right alongside the B-17s, deep inside the Third Reich. Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring allegedly stated that seeing those fighters over the capital was the exact moment he knew the war was lost. Yet just 5 months earlier, the U.S. 8th Air Force was bleeding to death, losing bombers at a catastrophic rate precisely because no fighter possessed the range to reach Berlin and return. How did a tactical dead end suddenly transform into the Luftwaffe's worst nightmare? The popular narrative usually points to a single miracle weapon saving the day, a gleaming silver fighter swooping in to rescue the bomber crews. But the grim reality of industrialized warfare rarely turns on an isolated invention. The true turning point in the European Air War was far more complex, forged through a desperate convergence of international engineering, massive logistical supply chains, and a ruthless overhaul of combat doctrine. The legend of an invincible machine often obscures the actual mechanics of how air supremacy was achieved. In reality, the destruction of the German fighter force hinged on an unlikely combination: a previously discarded American airframe, a supercharged British engine, and the mass production of fragile, disposable external fuel tanks. Yet, even with these technological leaps, a machine alone does not win a war of attrition. Breaking the back of the Luftwaffe required a fundamental, highly aggressive shift in command strategy that transformed these new fighters from passive defensive shields into relentless hunters. To understand how the Allies systematically dismantled German air defenses and achieved absolute supremacy by the spring of 1944, we first have to return to the bloodiest, most devastating period of the American daylight bombing campaign, a time when the entire strategy was on the verge of total collapse. The fundamental flaw that almost broke the United States Army Air Forces in 1943 was born from a mathematically unproven pre-war theory. American air doctrine rested on a singular, powerful concept: the self-defending bomber formation. Military planners in the 1930s looked at the massive Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress and the consolidated B-24 Liberator and concluded that they did not need fighter planes to hold their hands. If you packed these heavy bombers tightly together into staggered formations known as combat boxes, their overlapping fields of fire would supposedly create an impenetrable sphere of defensive lead. A massive armada could fly in broad daylight, pinpoint targets, and fight its way home through sheer firepower. Unescorted daylight precision bombing wasn't just a tactic, it was the entire justification for an independent heavy bomber force. But the theorists drafting these manuals had fatally underestimated two critical variables: the absolute tyranny of distance and the highly adaptive ruthlessness of the German Luftwaffe. To bomb the industrial heart of the Third Reich, American bombers flying out of bases in East Anglia had to cross the English Channel, traverse occupied Europe, and push deep into German airspace. For the first hour of these missions, crews felt a sense of security, escorted by some of the most capable fighter aircraft of the war. The British Supermarine Spitfire was a legendary victor of the Battle of Britain, but it was designed primarily as a short-range point defense interceptor. It could barely cross the channel before its fuel gauges dropped dangerously low. The primary American fighter, the massive Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, was a rugged juggernaut, devastating in a dive. But the Thunderbolt was incredibly thirsty. Even when equipped with early external fuel tanks, its combat radius was severely limited. 8th Air Force pilots could escort bombers across occupied Holland and Belgium, perhaps pushing as far inland as Aachen. But right at the geographic threshold of Germany itself, the needles on their fuel dials dictated an unyielding law of physics. The escort fighters had to bank sharply, turn west, and head back to England. The German Fighter Command, directed by men like General of the Fighters Adolf Galland, recognized this geographical hard limit almost immediately. The Luftwaffe did not need to waste its strength fighting Thunderbolts and Spitfires over the coast. Instead, they weaponized the map. German radar stations, strung along the Atlantic Wall and stretching deep into the continent, tracked the massive American bomber streams from the moment they gained altitude over England. They calculated the speed, the trajectory, and, most importantly, the exact point of no return for the Allied fighter escorts. The Luftwaffe simply held its ground. They marshaled their forces, squadron after squadron of Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt Bf 109s, and waited in the skies over Germany, hovering just beyond the invisible perimeter of American fighter range. For the 10-man crews inside the B-17s, the departure of their escorts was a moment of profound psychological dread. They watched the Thunderbolts wag their wings in a final salute before peeling away. And almost exactly at that moment, the radio chatter would spike. The German fighters, fresh, fully fueled, and holding the altitude advantage, would begin their assault. What followed was not chaotic dogfighting, but a methodical, industrialized slaughter. German pilots quickly realized that attacking the combat boxes from the rear meant flying directly into concentrated defensive fire. Instead, Luftwaffe tacticians developed the head-on attack. Closing at a combined speed of nearly 600 miles per hour, Focke-Wulfs would dive directly at the noses of the American bombers, exploiting a blind spot in the early B-17 models. It required iron nerves, but it was devastatingly effective, shattering plexiglass and killing pilots instantly. Furthermore, because there were no Allied fighters left to harass them, the Germans could afford to deploy heavy, twin-engine Messerschmitt Bf 110s and Junkers Ju-88s. Stripped of their night fighter or bomber roles, these aircraft were repurposed as flying artillery. Armed with massive 21-centimeter rockets and heavy 30-millimeter cannons, they flew parallel to the bomber stream, completely out of range of the Americans' 50-caliber machine guns, and lobbed explosives into the tight formations. The overlapping fields of fire meant absolutely nothing if the enemy could shoot you from a mile away. When a rocket struck, the formation loosened, stragglers fell behind, and single-engine fighters swarmed the damaged aircraft. The grim arithmetic of this unequal contest reached its horrifying climax in the autumn of 1943. In August, the 8th Air Force launched a highly ambitious, dual-pronged, deep penetration raid against the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and the aircraft plants at Regensburg. Out of 376 bombers dispatched, 60 were shot down, a catastrophic loss rate of 16% in a single day. Dozens more limped back so badly damaged they had to be scrapped. But the command pushed forward, believing the Luftwaffe was equally exhausted. 2 months later, on October 14, 1943, a date forever known as Black Thursday, the Americans returned to Schweinfurt. Again, the escorts turned back at the border. Again, the Luftwaffe was waiting. Of the 291 B-17 that crossed into enemy airspace, 60 were blasted out of the sky, 17 crashed on the way home, and over 120 were heavily damaged. Over 600 American airmen were lost in a matter of hours. The mathematics of the air war were now glaringly obvious, and they were fundamentally unsustainable. A loss rate of 5% per mission was considered the absolute maximum a bomber force could endure and still maintain operational cohesion over a tour of duty. The 8th Air Force was pushing 20% on deep penetrations. Factories back in Michigan and Washington State could build replacement bombers relatively quickly, but no factory could instantly produce a 20-year-old pilot, a trained navigator, or an experienced bombardier. The human cost was hemorrhaging the lifeblood of the air campaign. General Ira Eaker and the top brass were faced with a paralyzing reality. The core doctrine of the American air war had failed. You could not destroy German industry if your bombers could not reach the target without being annihilated. Consequently, deep penetration daylight raids into Germany were abruptly halted. The bombers were restricted to targets in France or coastal regions where the Thunderbolts could protect them. The entire strategic bombing campaign, the cornerstone of the Allied effort to cripple the Third Reich, was on the verge of being cancelled outright. A solution for a truly long-range escort fighter had to be found immediately, not on a drafting board, but right now, even if it meant piecing it together from existing parts. The suspension of deep penetration raids wasn't a tactical choice. It was a surrender to the unyielding laws of thermodynamics. But while the bomber crews were forced to remain grounded, a separate, almost clandestine evolution was unfolding within the technical divisions of the 8th Air Force. The solution to the distance problem didn't emerge from a secret laboratory, but from a desperate, somewhat makeshift marriage of existing technologies that had been sitting in plain sight. For months, The North American P-51 Mustang had been an underappreciated workhorse of the Allied inventory. In its original configuration, the Mustang was a brilliant aerodynamic frame crippled by an Allison engine that lost power rapidly as it climbed. It was effectively relegated to ground attack roles, coastal sorties, and low-altitude reconnaissance. But the British had already identified the Mustang's latent potential, recognizing that its laminar flow wing was decades ahead of its time. They proposed a radical mechanical swap, replacing the Allison with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. It was an inspired pairing. The Merlin provided the high-altitude power that the Mustang's airframe deserved, instantly turning it into a capable interceptor. However, horsepower alone did not solve the crisis of distance. The Reich was still too far. The final piece of this technological puzzle was something most combat pilots initially viewed with profound suspicion: the external drop tank. Engineers scrambled to perfect tanks made of pressed paper and lightweight aluminum, inexpensive, flimsy, and seemingly disposable. To the fighter pilots of 1943, strapping these tanks to the wings felt like carrying a ticking time bomb. They were prone to leaks. They significantly hampered maneuverability, and to a young pilot trained in the art of the dogfight, they were a distinct liability. Yet, the math was irrefutable. Without these tanks, the Mustang was just another short-range fighter. With them, the radius of operations expanded by hundreds of miles. By the early weeks of 1944, the P-51B Mustang arrived in Europe in significant numbers. It was the synthesis of an efficient airframe, a world-class power plant, and the extra fuel capacity required to finally stretch the war to the enemy's doorstep. When these fighters touched down at their air bases in East Anglia, the technical capability to strike Berlin had, for the first time, moved from theory into reality. The Allies finally possessed a machine that could cross the continent, engage the enemy at 30,000 feet, and still hold enough fuel in reserve to make the return trip. Yet possessing the equipment was only half the struggle. Having a plane that could reach Berlin was an engineering triumph, but integrating this new tool into the rigid, failing structure of the bombing campaign was an entirely different challenge. The equipment was ready, but the combat doctrine that would actually allow these fighters to be used effectively was still non-existent. They had the reach, but the question remained: would the high command have the audacity to break their own rules and unleash these machines? The answer arrived in January 1944, wearing the two stars of a major general. When Jimmy Doolittle took command of the 8th Air Force, replacing Ira Eaker, he inherited a fighter force that was tactically handcuffed. The prevailing doctrine, rigidly enforced for months, was tethered close escort. Fighter pilots were explicitly ordered to stay glued to the bombers they were protecting. In the headquarters of Major General William Kepner, the commander of the 8th Fighter Command, there was a prominent sign on the wall that perfectly encapsulated this defensive mindset. It read, "The first duty of the 8th Air Force fighter is to bring the bombers back alive." When Doolittle saw that sign, he recognized the fatal flaw immediately. By forcing high-performance fighters to fly at the sluggish pace of a B-17, roughly 160 miles per hour, the Americans were surrendering all tactical initiative to the Luftwaffe. A fighter tethered to a bomber formation has to constantly weave back and forth just to avoid stalling, burning precious fuel and sacrificing altitude. When the German interceptors attacked, diving from above with maximum kinetic energy, the American defenders had to break their weave, accelerate from a slow speed, and attempt to climb to meet them. It was a physics problem with a lethal outcome, and Doolittle erased it with a single, ruthless stroke. According to 8th Air Force lore, Doolittle ordered the sign taken down. The new directive was stark, aggressive, and uncompromising. The first duty of the 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy German fighters. This was not a mere shift in semantics. It was a fundamental rewiring of the entire air war. Doolittle unshackled his pilots. Instead of waiting for the Luftwaffe to assemble and strike the combat boxes, American fighters were organized into independent fighter sweeps. Squadrons of Mustangs and Thunderbolts were ordered to fly 30, 50, sometimes 100 miles ahead of the bomber streams. They were instructed to climb to 30,000 feet, establish a dominant perch in the sun, and actively hunt for the German assembly areas. The heavy bombers, while still the primary means of destroying German industry, had effectively become the largest, most expensive bait in the history of warfare. Their purpose was to force the Luftwaffe into the air, where Doolittle's fighters could eradicate them. For the German air defense network, the sudden shift in American tactics triggered an immediate operational shock. To understand the panic this caused, you have to look at how the Luftwaffe had organized the daytime defense of the Reich. German radar controllers tracked the massive American bomber streams and scrambled their forces, but they relied heavily on specialized twin-engine interceptors known as Zerstörer, the destroyers. Aircraft like the Messerschmitt Bf-110, the Junkers Ju-88, and the newer Messerschmitt Me-410 Hornisse were the primary killers of the heavy bombers. They were heavily armored and bristled with forward-firing armament, including massive 21-centimeter Werfer-Granate rockets and heavy 30mm cannons. Because they were so heavy, these Zerstörers required time and safe airspace to climb to 25,000 feet and form up into large, coordinated attack waves known as a Pulk. For months, they had done this in relative safety over central Germany, operating under the assumption that American escorts had already hit their fuel limits and turned back at the border. But in the early spring of 1944, as these heavy German interceptors were slowly clawing their way up to altitude, engines straining, the pilots looked through their canopies and saw a physical impossibility. High above them, glinting in the freezing air, were single-engine Allied fighters. The Mustangs had arrived deep over Germany before the bombers even appeared on the horizon. The resulting encounters were not dogfights, they were massacres. A twin-engine Messerschmitt Bf-110, heavy with armor and rockets, was completely defenseless against a P-51 diving out of the sun at over 400 miles per hour. The heavy German fighters lacked the maneuverability to turn with a Mustang and lacked the speed to dive away. When bounced by Doolittle's vanguard, the German formations disintegrated. The Zerstörergeschwader suffered such catastrophic, unsustainable losses in a matter of weeks that the Luftwaffe High Command was forced into a humiliating retreat. They had to pull their heavy, rocket-firing interceptors out of the daylight defense of the Reich almost entirely, relegating them strictly to night fighter duties. In a single tactical stroke, the American bombers were stripped of their most lethal predator. The burden of defending the homeland now fell exclusively on the single-engine Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s. But these pilots were now trapped in a deadly tactical paradox. Luftwaffe Command demanded that they ignore the American fighters and press their attacks against the heavy bombers. But ignoring a Mustang positioned on your tail was an instant death sentence. The German defensive strategy shattered. Yet this tactical revolution was underpinned by a massive, grinding industrial disparity that went far beyond the sleek aerodynamics of the Mustang's fuselage. The air war over Europe was fundamentally an economic engine running at maximum capacity, and the Allies simply possessed an industrial ecosystem the Germans could not match. The most glaring example of this mismatch was the external drop tank. A P-51 could carry two 75-gallon or 108-gallon drop tanks under its wings. These tanks were manufactured by the tens of thousands in the United States and Britain, often constructed from resin-impregnated pressed paper to save critical aluminum for airframes. When the drop tanks were empty, or the moment a pilot spotted enemy aircraft and entered combat, he simply pulled a mechanical release lever and dropped them over the German countryside. It was a staggering logistical flex. The Allies were discarding thousands of precision-manufactured components every single day as literal garbage, simply because their supply chains could afford to replace them endlessly. Behind those tanks was the lifeblood of the air war, high-octane aviation gasoline. The Allies were refining and shipping millions of gallons of 100 to 130 octane fuel across the Atlantic, guarded by massive naval convoys. This high-grade fuel allowed the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine to run at extreme manifold pressures without detonating, granting the Mustang pilot a vital burst of combat emergency power to outclimb or out-accelerate a German opponent in a life-or-death situation. On the other side of the front line, the German industrial machine was slowly asphyxiating. While Albert Speer's Ministry of Armaments miraculously managed to maintain and even increase raw airframe production through 1944, By dispersing factories into railway tunnels, deep forests, and underground bunkers using brutal, forced labor, their efforts were ultimately hollow. An airplane without fuel is nothing more than a static aluminum sculpture. The Allied strategic bombing campaign, recognizing this critical vulnerability, ruthlessly targeted German synthetic oil plants and refineries. Consequently, German fuel quality degraded severely. Their engineers were forced to tune the BMW and Daimler-Benz engines to run on lower-grade 87-octane B4 fuel. This meant less horsepower at altitude, less acceleration, and a permanent technological handicap. The Luftwaffe was forced to fight the most advanced aerial campaign in history with an engine choking on substandard fuel. With the logistical tether cut and the fighters unleashed, the sky over Europe quickly devolved into an attritional meat grinder of unprecedented scale. The American strategy shifted from merely targeting precision infrastructure to a deliberate war of total eradication. General Doolittle and General Karl Spaatz understood a grim mathematical reality. To win the air war and make the upcoming invasion of Europe possible, they had to kill the German fighter force, period. In the headquarters of the German Fighter Command, Adolf Galland, the general of the fighters, watched the daily casualty reports with growing alarm. The initial German underestimation of the escort fighters turned into a panicked realization that they were being systematically hunted and destroyed in their own skies. The American fighter sweeps were merciless and unceasing. Mustangs and Thunderbolts weren't just escorting the bombers. On their way home, they were ordered to drop down to the deck and strafe German airfields, shoot up locomotives, and destroy Luftwaffe aircraft as they helplessly taxied on their own runways. There was no longer a safe zone anywhere in the Third Reich. But the most devastating blow to the German war effort was not the loss of machines. It was the catastrophic hemorrhage of human experience. The Luftwaffe was rapidly bleeding out its Experten, the highly decorated, seasoned veterans who had formed the absolute backbone of the fighter arm since the Spanish Civil War. Men who had survived the Battle of Britain, the grueling desert campaigns in North Africa, and the brutal, freezing skies of the Eastern Front were suddenly being shot down and killed over their own hometowns. The operational tempo was entirely asymmetrical. An American pilot flew a defined tour of duty, perhaps 250 to 300 combat hours, and then was rotated back to the United States to train others, pass on his knowledge, or simply rest. A German pilot flew until he was killed, captured, or physically incapacitated. There was no rotation. There was no rest. Desperate German pilots were launching 3, 4, even 5 times a day, taking off into a sky where they were routinely outnumbered 4 to 1. The psychological toll of climbing into a cockpit day after day, knowing the enemy possessed superior numbers, superior altitude, and a violently aggressive new doctrine, eroded the morale of even the most hardened veterans. The strain of constant combat, compounded by political pressure from leaders like Hermann Göring, who accused the fighter pilots of cowardice for failing to stop the bombers, pushed the German veteran corps to the breaking point. As these veterans fell out of the sky in increasing numbers, the true, fatal consequence of this meat grinder became terrifyingly apparent. The German training pipeline, completely starved of resources, collapsed inward on itself in a terminal death spiral. To replace the horrific losses inflicted by the roaming packs of Mustangs and Thunderbolts, the Luftwaffe had to push fresh cadets through the training system at a frantic, reckless pace. But because of the severe fuel shortages caused by the bombing of the refineries, there was simply no aviation gasoline to spare for training flights. Every drop was needed for the defense of the Reich. Consequently, a German pilot recruit in the spring of 1944 was rushed through a severely truncated curriculum. They were sent to frontline combat units with perhaps 150 total hours of flight time. Worse, they often had a fraction of that time, sometimes as little as 20 or 30 hours, in the actual high-performance fighter they were expected to fly in combat. They barely knew how to take off and land a high-torque aircraft without killing themselves, let alone how to manage complex engine mixtures at high altitude, navigate by instruments through heavy cloud cover, or perform deflection shooting against a violently maneuvering target. Compare that grim reality to the American replacements arriving at bases in England. The United States Army Air Forces possessed the luxury of vast, unthreatened airspace over Texas, Florida, and California, alongside an absolute ocean of aviation fuel. An American pilot stepping off a transport ship in Britain usually had upwards of 400 hours of flight time. They had extensive training in aerial gunnery using towed targets, complex formation flying, and advanced tactical maneuvers. When these green, undertrained German teenagers were hurled into the sky against well-trained, aggressive American pilots flying superior aircraft, the result wasn't combat, it was an execution. The German recruits lacked the fundamental situational awareness required to survive in a chaotic, three-dimensional battle space. They didn't know how to clear their tails. They often failed to even see the Mustangs before the 50-caliber armor-piercing incendiary rounds ripped through their fuel tanks. They were frequently shot down on their first or second missions. And because they died so quickly, they could never gain the vital combat experience necessary to survive the next mission. It was a vicious, self-perpetuating cycle of destruction. The rapid death rate of the rookies also meant that the surviving veterans were severely overworked, constantly forced to protect their inexperienced wingmen instead of fighting the enemy aggressively, which in turn led to more veterans being killed. The institutional knowledge of the Luftwaffe was bleeding out into the soil of Germany, and it could never be replaced by any factory. The German fighter arm was being systematically bled dry. The defensive shield that had once inflicted horrific, crippling casualties on the unescorted bomber streams just months prior was now fracturing under the weight of this relentless, industrialized strategy of attrition. The Americans had the technology, the unlimited fuel, the superior training pipeline, and, crucially, the ruthless tactical doctrine to exploit them all. The hunters had definitively become the hunted. This grinding war of numbers and logistics was rapidly escalating, preparing the stage for a massive, decisive confrontation over the very heart of the Reich itself. Decades of post-war cinema and historical literature have heavily romanticized this phase of the conflict, cementing the legend of the P-51 Mustang as a gleaming silver knight riding to the rescue of beleaguered bomber crews. The popular narrative suggests a clean, almost chivalric triumph of American engineering, a miracle weapon that simply outflew, outturned, and outgunned the German opposition. But digging into the declassified operational orders and the stark casualty reports of the 8th Air Force reveals a much colder, far more clinical truth. The heroic myth of the Mustang often deliberately obscures the brutal reality of how air superiority was actually purchased over the skies of Europe. It was not won through noble, individual aerial duels. It was won through overwhelming industrial output and a calculated reliance on human exhaustion. The Mustang was undeniably a vital, high-performance tool, but it was not a magical silver bullet that won the war on its own. The true, fatal blow to the Luftwaffe was the systemic, mathematical collapse of their infrastructure, a collapse deliberately engineered by an Allied command that understood the ruthless economics of total war. The Germans were not simply defeated by a superior piece of aviation technology. They were actively buried under the crushing weight of an industrialized attrition strategy. The Allied command deliberately utilized the long range of the P-51 not just to passively defend, but to serve as the primary weapon in a grand, unrelenting harvest of enemy pilots. It was a strategy entirely devoid of romance, relying instead on the unforgiving logic of factory quotas, fuel logistics, and a replacement pipeline that could comfortably absorb combat losses while simultaneously annihilating the enemy's veteran corps. This was the grim reality hidden behind the legend. Air supremacy was achieved through a relentlessly organized system of attrition that favored the side with infinite supply lines. The Luftwaffe was forced to fight a war they were mathematically destined to lose. And this unforgiving equation of industrialized combat was about to be put to its ultimate, most highly visible test. The strategy of total eradication had sufficiently hollowed out the German defenses, clearing the path for a decisive, inescapable blow. In the spring of 1944, the 8th Air Force prepared to abandon the periphery and drive a stake directly into the heart of Germany. The blow finally landed in the first week of March 1944. Exploiting the brutal momentum gained during the relentless, week-long bombing campaign known as Big Week in late February, the Allies pushed their armada toward the ultimate target, Berlin. For the Luftwaffe, The defense of the capital was an existential imperative. Hermann Göring had famously boasted years earlier that no enemy bomber would ever reach the city. Now, massive streams of American heavy bombers were vibrating the skies over the Reich Chancellery. German Fighter Command scraped together every available operational unit to meet the threat. They launched a maximum effort defense, throwing hundreds of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs into the freezing air. The Luftwaffe interceptors clawed their way up to 28,000 feet, vectoring toward the vast American combat boxes. The veteran German pilots, expecting the unescorted bombers they were used to fighting deep inside the Reich, prepared for the familiar, bloody routine of head-on attacks. But as they closed the distance over the outskirts of the capital, the German formations were met with a sight that defied their fundamental understanding of the air war. Swarms of P-51 Mustangs, having flown over 600 miles from bases in England, were already waiting, circling high above the bombers in the glare of the sun. As the German interceptors committed to their attack runs, a coordinated rain of thousands of aluminum and pressed paper drop tanks tumbled from the wings of the American fighters, spiraling down toward the city below. It was the absolute confirmation that the escort was completely unshackled, unburdened of its extra weight, and ready to hunt. What followed were some of the most massive and sprawling aerial battles in human history. The airspace over Berlin transformed into a chaotic, three-dimensional melee involving well over 1,000 aircraft. Mustangs plunged from their high-altitude perches, tearing into the German formations before the interceptors could even align their gun sights on the B-17. The rigid German defensive structures immediately disintegrated. The combat broke down into hundreds of individual, desperate dogfights, stretching from the stratosphere down to the very rooftops of the capital. In this concentrated crucible, the Luftwaffe did not just lose machines. They suffered a fatal decapitation of their combat leadership. The merciless tempo of the American sweeps over Berlin systematically hunted down the last remaining experienced flight leaders, squadron commanders, and irreplaceable aces. Men who possessed the critical tactical intuition to survive and lead were killed in a matter of days, at a rate the shattered German training pipeline could never absorb. The qualitative edge of the German fighter force was permanently destroyed in the skies over its own capital. The massive raids continued throughout March, relentlessly grinding the Luftwaffe into dust. Eventually, the roaring dogfights over Berlin began to quiet, replaced by the increasingly uncontested drone of American engines. But the outcome of this colossal battle of attrition echoed far beyond the borders of Germany, permanently altering the timeline of the war. When those German interceptor pilots looked through their canopies over Berlin in early March 1944 and saw American fighters flying directly alongside the heavy bombers, they weren't just looking at an engineering marvel. They were staring at the physical manifestation of their own logistical ruin. The shock of seeing single-engine aircraft deep inside the capital's airspace finally shattered the illusion of an impenetrable geographic fortress. The Luftwaffe's entire defensive doctrine had been staked on a single premise: the absolute belief that the enemy could not stretch his protective shield across the continent. But the arrival of the Mustang, fueled by millions of gallons of high-octane gasoline and tethered to a limitless supply chain of disposable drop tanks, proved that distance was no longer a weapon the Third Reich could exploit. The strategy of waiting just beyond the fuel limits of the Spitfire and the Thunderbolt had been completely dismantled. Hermann Göring's alleged despair upon seeing those fighters was not simply a reaction to a new airplane. It was the sudden, paralyzing realization that the Allies had engineered a way to enforce total, inescapable eradication anywhere on the map. The destruction of the German fighter force in the freezing skies over its own cities carried a consequence that reached far beyond the strategic bombing campaign. By methodically hunting down and annihilating the veteran corps of the Luftwaffe in the spring of 1944, the 8th Air Force effectively secured the airspace for the largest amphibious invasion in human history. Just 3 months after those massive dogfights over the German capital, thousands of Allied ships crossed the English Channel to assault the beaches of Normandy. As American, British, and Canadian troops waded through the surf on D-Day, They did not have to fight a two-front battle. The sky above them was virtually empty of enemy aircraft. The German fighters that should have been strafing the landing craft and dive-bombing the congested beachheads simply did not exist. They had already been turned into burning wreckage hundreds of miles away, systematically consumed in a calculated war of attrition that forever broke the back of the German Air Force. The P-51 Mustang did not win the European air war because it was an invincible miracle of aviation, but because it arrived at the exact mathematical limit of the Third Reich's physical and psychological endurance. This gleaming fighter was merely the final, perfectly engineered executioner for a massive Allied industrial machine that the Luftwaffe could never hope to outrun. Ultimately, the skies over Germany were not conquered by a single silver airplane, but by the cold, unyielding mathematics of a global supply chain that deliberately and systematically suffocated a dying empire.